This question is from Kevy1967, who asks, how can Labour politicians continue to call themselves Labour when they have moved so far away from the founding principles of the Labour Party they are now totally unrecognisable? Okay, so this is a big talking point. It's essentially the big question of, has Labour shifted to the right, or is it being true to its values? And it depends on sort of where you sit in terms of the electorate, how you feel about this, Luke. What do you think? Because the last budget, the most recent budget, was billed as a, true Labour budget to please Labour MPs as well as Labour voters.
Well, I think the interesting for Labour is that Labour in this country has changed in terms of workers have changed. So, union membership in 1979, which at the height of union membership, was 13.2 million. Now it's only 6 million. So it's a massive drop, right? And in a sense, if you're trying to build a coalition of voters now to win elections, and you're the Labour Party, you have to reach out for a whole other different group of people. Mm. You can't just represent the traditional kind of workers anymore. You have to kind of reach out to migrants, to other groups. And I think that's the problem for Labour, is it has to appeal to a much broader base, which then means if you appeal to that broad base, you start moving away from the core values that people expect you to have.
Yeah, and people aren't divided by left and right in that straightforward way anymore, are they, Rachel? You could have people with £2 million houses who might be pro the mansion tax that they've just introduced because of the way that politics is sort of a little bit topsy-turvy these days. Yeah, so you've got left and right economically, you've got left and right in kind of social, progressive, conservative, cultural issues. Yeah. You've got open, closed when it comes to migration. But you've also, and I think Luke makes a really, really critical point, that in this bracket of working people, you've got young graduates who maybe have good earning potential, but really high debts and no hope of ever being on the housing ladder. You've got your sort of archetypal working class, red wall, white van man style voter as well. You've got NHS workers who perhaps have come from another country or who are the children of migrants who came to work in the NHS. You've got the people from the EU who migrated, who actually many of them have gone back, but are sort of their families. And in all of those categories, you've got, in terms of what your economic kind of priorities are, there's a vast difference, house prices or childcare or debt or pensions or whatever. I think one of the key ways in which the electorate has changed is that we are now more broken down along age lines than we ever have been before. And you get sort of within a class category, somebody who is retired and owns their own house. Does it really matter what job they did when they were working? If you look at their economic situation compared to somebody who's, not in that position, trying to earn those things, does it matter what their parents did? And you've got the discrepancy between income and wealth. And it's all very confusing and it makes it very difficult to build coalitions. But I wanted to ask Luke a question because you know all about this. This question says they've moved away from the founding principles of the Labour Party. Could you just give us a minute primer on what the founding principles of the Labour Party were?
Well, I suppose Labour was founded ultimately to represent the unions. That was kind of the core part of it, that it was essentially supposed to take on workers' rights, push for better conditions for workers. It was supposed to be organised labour, in effect. And it was just a completely different country. If you think about Britain used to make things.
Yeah.
It was a huge manufacturing base. You had factories, podcasts, yeah. And, white collar workers now. I mean, there's a whole other question about who's working class in this country anymore, exactly, or what defines a working class person. But I do think, it was organised labour. It was supposed to kind of campaign for working conditions. It was born out of the factory floor. I think that was much easier to organise that way as well. And when you have a country now where union membership's collapsing, I had a conversation with Christina McInerney, the General Secretary of Unison, and she kind of made this point about union membership. She's like, Unison represent over 1 million workers. It's roughly a fifth of all union members in the country, and 70% of women. And you can't win elections, unfortunately, with that few people, and so it is kind of a question now of how does Labour reorganise itself? If you want it to be more left wing, what group does it organise around? Who is the working class now? Because it's drifted so far from those principles, but also the country's just changed.
Yes, I remember speaking to the head of the Prospect Professional Workers Union on the podcast, and he made that point about how, the average union member that you have in the public imagination is very different now from what a union worker who might have voted Labour back in the 70s would have looked like. People from the precariat, Rachel, white collar workers, women, creatives, people who might have very different politics, perhaps, from that industrial base that we've just been talking about. And then you have the irony, actually, that I presume someone who's sent in a question like this is perhaps concerned about some of the positions Labour has taken on cultural issues like immigration or trans rights, and doesn't feel that they're necessarily sort of representing their view of what a left-wing government should do. But a lot of that has come from that losing those red wall votes and feeling as if they no longer represent those once industrial heartlands. Those people were the sort of people who were members of those unions, formed the working class, but now they might own their homes outright, not be working, be retired, and have a completely different stake in how the economy is run. And so I think you have an irony there where, Labour in a way is trying to represent its traditional supporters, but its traditional supporters want different things from what the progressive voters who have, propped Labour up over the, past couple of years would want. So I think that's a big issue as well, and perhaps little understood when you see the kind of more cliched reporting about the red wall.
And I think there's also a psychological issue with how we as a country view industries that maybe are historically very important. I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, and I'm sorry, and that are historically important for good reasons, but versus the way things actually are now. So if you look at fishing, for example, very, very small share of our of jobs in GDP. There are more yoga instructors in the country than there are people working in the fishing industry. That's a slightly facetious stat to use because people can work part-time as a yoga teacher. But I think it's just important with like how many people are we talking about? Steel, really significant in terms of national resilience, but in terms of jobs, it's a small number. And when you look at, for example, Britain's higher education sector, which is pretty world leading still, and is one of the key sources of employment, particularly in a lot of those places where maybe they have a post-industrial history and now they've got a university and like the university is the main employer. When you have politicians go like, oh yeah, we really need to save our university sector, they get vilified for it. We don't see that as being as valuable to our national makeup as we do some of those more traditional industries. And traditional industries are very important in their local areas. And I'm really not trying to say fishing and steel aren't important, but I'm saying that there are other things that are important that we don't put the same emphasis on. And we don't see people who work in a university as being working people in the same way that we see people who work in a steel factory. Yeah. And that skews where political priorities are.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if all of the universities that are in such a precarious position were steelworks or
we'd be hearing a lot more about them.
I mean, there would be a lot of long reads.